Iulia Trombitcaia, da UNECE, que nos vai falar que está connosco por Zoom, e que nos vai falar dos princípios para desenvolver acordos na cooperação transfronteiriça. Deixem-me só aqui tentar ligar o Zoom. Iulia. Iulia is going to make this presentation in English, and so we'll have the next two presentations. No, Iulia is making the presentation in English, and Eric is making the presentation in Spanish, which is great. So Iulia, I think we can start. Let me just close.
Thank you very much, Katarina. Did I understand correctly that you gave me the floor?
Sorry, Iulia. Yes, now I gave you the floor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It is my pleasure to address you on behalf of the Secretariat of the Water Convention, also known as the Helsinki Convention or UNECE Water Convention or 1992 Convention. The Water Convention supports cooperation over transboundary rivers, lakes, and aquifers to ensure that they are managed in a sustainable and equitable manner. And its key pillars are the due diligence obligation to prevent transboundary impact, the equitable and reasonable utilization principle, and the obligation of cooperation. And currently, the Water Convention counts today 46 parties. Portugal and Spain are parties to the convention, as also is the European Union. The Water Convention is a classical multilateral framework agreement. One of its obligations is the requirement for riparian parties to enter into specific agreements and establish joint bodies for their shared waters. This obligation, along with the obligation to hold consultations, exchange information, perform joint monitoring, helps countries sharing the same transboundary waters to actually implement their core obligation of cooperation and to define what is equitable and reasonable use and how to apply the no harm rule in their particular case. In 2015, when the General Assembly adopted the Sustainable Development Goals and their indicators, a dedicated SDG indicator 6.5.2 was adopted for transboundary water cooperation. And this indicator measures effective transboundary water cooperation, setting the criteria for operational agreements. One of the criteria is the existence of a joint body. So the obligation to conclude agreements and set up effective joint institutions has also received recognition in the SDGs. The most recent reporting exercise for parties to the Water Convention has shown that where agreements for transboundary waters are in place, in most cases, participating countries take part in a joint body established to facilitate their implementation. And many of the tasks and activities set out in the Water Convention are reflected in the tasks and activities of joint bodies reported by parties. However, some tasks and activities, such as, for example, setting of emission limits and participation in transboundary environmental impact assessment, appear to be less well represented. Also, few joint bodies have tasks related to civilians and early warning of water-related diseases, and less than half are entrusted with public participation and consultation or climate change adaptation. As the Water Convention is a framework agreement, its general principles and requirements are further developed and made operational through the adoption of protocols and certain non-binding soft law instruments in the form of guidelines and recommendations. Such soft law instruments actually summarize the best practice of parties and are formally adopted by the meeting of the parties to the Water Convention. And I would like to introduce you today several soft law instruments which pertain to the core obligation of riparian parties to conclude agreements and set up joint bodies for transboundary water cooperation. One of such instruments is the Principles for Effective Joint Bodies for Transboundary Water Cooperation. This instrument recognizes that joint institutions created by riparian countries can have various shapes, and the practice is very different in this area, and there is no one-size-fits-all approach possible here. However, there are certain principles which can be identified from the state practice, which generally make joint bodies more effective. So this soft law document includes about 20 principles grouped in several categories, and I would like to highlight a couple of them. The principle of adequate organizational structure means that a joint body should have the institutional structure that allows it not only to develop and adopt decisions, but also to implement them. So a joint body should have decision-making bodies, executive bodies, working or technical bodies, including preferably a permanent organ such as a secretariat. And it is important that tasks and functions for each body within the organizational structure are clearly defined. The principles for effective joint bodies also highlight that effective accountability mechanisms for the joint body should be in place to ensure the implementation of its activities and obligations. And clearly defined reporting lines and mechanisms should also be established. They also highlight that mechanisms for public participation and stakeholder involvement in the activities of the joint body should be in place. And appropriate tools for public participation should be selected according to their purpose. And for a consistent provision of funds to support public participation and stakeholder involvement, it is important to institutionalize the mechanism for participation of stakeholders. The joint body should also provide a framework for monitoring of transboundary impacts and long-term impacts of infrastructure projects. The principles also emphasize the need for adequate financial and human resources. In fact, adequate financial and human resources in the riparian states and in the secretariat of a joint body where it exists should be available to support the joint body's organizational structure and to ensure not only the development of decisions, but also implementation of joint programs. And budgetary resources from riparian states usually are and should be the primary financial source to support joint bodies and basin activities. Also, the principles highlight the need for clearly defining the financial commitments of parties, including financial contributions from member states and their in-kind responsibilities. Another instrument that can support countries in the design and drafting of new agreements and update of existing agreements is the practical guide for the development of agreements adopted by the meeting of the parties to the convention last year. It includes recommendations for the content of agreements and also various drafting options with an objective to ensure that the agreements on transboundary waters concluded by riparian countries are effective, adaptable, and also sustainable in the long term. So the practical guide includes several thematic models, and each thematic model has several building blocks, which are actually the provisions or the issues that countries may consider, including when developing their agreements. It also includes examples from treaty practice from all over the world, which illustrate how to frame a particular provision in a treaty. And the practical guide also includes references to various supporting resources which can assist countries in further developing the content of their agreements. And the last soft law instrument that I would like to bring to your attention is a handbook on water allocation in a transboundary context. It's a soft law instrument adopted by the meeting of the parties to the convention last year. It actually tackles the most complex issue for transboundary water cooperation, the water allocation, and it explains various approaches to water allocation and includes 46 case studies from the global practice. One of the key messages of the handbook is that new transboundary water allocation agreements need to be designed to be able to be adaptable in the medium and long term to various changing hydrological, climatic, and other related factors. And existing water allocation agreements and existing arrangements may also need to be revised to be able to respond to changing conditions. So this adaptive capacity can be integrated into the transboundary allocation systems and institutions to respond to the changing conditions, impacts, and opportunities. And another message that you will find in the handbook on water allocation is that the growing treaty practice actually reflects that countries tend to prioritize human needs and also ecological needs, so-called EFLOs, before they actually allocate available water resources to other needs. The Water Convention works a lot on adaptation to climate change in transboundary basins so that countries could benefit from joint planning and implementation of activities on adaptation to climate change. A task force on water and climate under the convention has been leading the activities in this area, which make actually the convention pioneer the approaches to climate change adaptation in transboundary basins. There is also a global network of basins working on climate change adaptation led by UNECE and INBO, which currently includes 18 basins sharing their experience on adaptation to climate change. And a new direction of work in this area is assistance to countries in preparation of bankable projects to climate funds. I have already mentioned several times the meeting of the parties and various other bodies of the Water Convention. So part of this institutional structure is also the implementation committee under the Water Convention, which supports implementation and compliance with this treaty. The implementation committee consists of 9 members, which are appointed by the meeting of the parties. And these are outstanding lawyers and water professionals who serve on the committee in their personal capacity in the best interest of the convention. The committee assists parties with implementation of the convention in their transboundary basins. And parties to the convention can approach the committee for advice in case they feel difficulties with implementation. They can also make submissions in case they believed that the contact of the other party to the convention prevents them from implementing the convention properly. Communications from the public are not a formal trigger in this implementation committee. However, NGOs and other members of the public can submit information to the committee, and the committee can consider such information in the framework of the committee initiative. So the implementation committee may take a variety of measures to support implementation and compliance. For example, it can provide assistance to countries in establishing transboundary water cooperation agreements, or it can also provide recommendations to countries regarding the strengthening of their domestic legal and regulatory regimes to support the implementation of the convention. However, the hard measures, for example, declaration of non-compliance, can only be taken by the meeting of the parties upon recommendation of the committee. So I would like to thank you very much for your attention and to wish you success in this meeting. Spain and Portugal are both actively involved in the Water Convention activities, but I think it's a healthy and a positive thing to discuss existing cooperation and to aim at achieving better results. And the Water Convention and its tools and mechanisms are available to support you in this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Iulia, for your wonderful and very complete presentation. So now we give the floor to Eric Tardieu from the International